It's often easy to ask, what's going on? Ourselves in this world, this life of fleeting happiness and constant effort, all these choices, and while all around us and even within us, there seems to be this sense of constant danger and horrors. So where does this all come from, and why is it this way? The Course teaches that all of this is a product of our desire for specialness. So what's specialness? Specialness is that longing for the experience of being significant, important, and meaningful, and that becomes our reality. We want to have this idea of specialness to mark our existence. What does specialness require? Specialness requires duality and guilt to offer the contrast, to offer the comparison. Specialness is a judgment, it's a will, it's a declaration of what I value, what I want. And so those would be the fundamental teachings of the Course as to what results in the experiences that we have. God, on the other hand, God as non-duality has no specialness. It's only love and peace. It's the purity of a singularity, single experience. And so there aren't any of the elements that are necessary for specialness. So what do? There's the non-duality of God, and then we have this tiny mad idea, this notion that there can be something separate and different from that, something outside of non-duality. Obviously, this is an impossibility. It's a fantasy because duality can't be born of non-duality. But our desire for specialness demands something that is separate and distinct, so we set up duality on this abstract level of thought to establish that. Now, as we've talked about before, simply that tiny mad idea of separation really doesn't leave us with anything. When non-duality is everything, to step outside of that, there is nothing. In order to give ourselves that contrast that we need and that sense of significance, we then fill our mind with the experience of guilt, another fantasy. And the whole purpose of that is to block out the memory of love, to cover up the clarity of my mind so I no longer remember truth. And so for all intents and purposes, by doing this, I have removed the awareness of non-duality of God from my existence. Now, as again we've talked about before, the experience of this guilt, this fear, this horror, this intensity of rage, and all of the things that mark being the home of evil, darkness, and sin becomes intolerable. So the next step then simply becomes to deny that that's the experience that I've made up, to deny that that's what's in my mind. And because it's so abstract, it really needs some specificity. Specialness is hard to act out as just kind of an abstraction without any tangible evidence. And so we need a world of specifics. And this is where the denial results in the projection, and then we establish our world of dream characters, of bodies and situations that occur in our day-to-day life in this world, in this universe. And that's where we arrive at. Now, because of the state of denial, we just as we no longer are aware of non-duality and God, we are no longer aware of our mind and the abstraction where this comes from. The difficulty, of course, is that the dream, the characters, the projection that makes our bodies in our world is founded on this idea of guilt. So all of this hate, all of this horror, all of this terror now gets projected onto bodies. And then we begin to have this experience, although we don't know where it's coming from. Again, very much like a puppet show. I see the puppets. I believe myself to be a puppet, but I don't see the puppet master. I'm a dream character, but I don't see the dreamer. So the Course is directed towards the decision-making part of my mind. It is never directed towards a body. Bodies are non-existent. At best, they're neutral. But it's my specialness, it's my individuation that demands that all experience seem to rotate around me here. And that is for the purpose, as we've talked about before, to act out this idea of specialness, to have significance, importance, and meaning, and for that to be my reality. And that is the founding, the making of the world. And I am totally unaware at this point that it is a fabrication of the mind, that it is a fabrication of the guilt that's in my mind, that is a fabrication of the idea that I could be separate from God. But again, it's that desire for being special, for being significant, that propels all of this. So the Course is always talking to the level of the decision maker in my mind, and again, never to the body. And that's part of the practice, is to begin to orient from the dream characters, from the puppets, going back to the source material where it is being actually operated and decided upon. Now, the conversation I began to have on the level of mind is that I give that other voice in my mind in the Course the name Jesus. We could certainly give it other names, but then we'd have to kind of analyze why we need our specialness to dictate what that name will be. But at any rate, what's going on the level of this abstract mind that is now occupied by this guilt is that there is this memory, there's this recollection of this not being the only option. And so the decision for guilt begins to fade a little bit, and this conversation begins to occur with the other side of that mind, in the Course known as the voice of Jesus. And what I'm beginning to do in listening to that voice is to understand that there is a different option that is not occupied by guilt. And so what I'm beginning to do when I move from the bodies to the mind and engage in this dialogue with the other option, the memory of truth in my mind, what I'm really beginning to replicate is my move from separation, my desire for specialness that requires this separation and duality, and rejoining that into one singularity that is the abstract mind. And now I'm listening to the memory of truth that even further unifies that. So all of that then becomes a reflection, the memory of truth. Now, oftentimes what happens is that as I begin to hear that voice, the Course also talks about it as a melody, that song, that voice that we simply can't get rid of completely because it is the only truth, is the memory of that truth. And in spite of my efforts to block that, the blocking is both intolerable and requires such a sustained vigilance on my part that at some point it has what the Course calls a holy instance and it falls away, and I remember truth. What oftentimes happens then is that I begin to experience that loss of specialness, that loss of self. And so I immediately pull up the guilt again to block the memory. And then the projection in the world is that my body or my person is going to have probably some experience of horror, of terrifying, of anxiety, of anger, and then get fooled again to think that there's something horrifying and awful going on here in this world. It might take the form of an illness, it might take the form of a friend dying or getting fired, or all those things that we like to attribute our negative, our discomfort, our awful experiences to in life. But what I need to remember is simply what's happening is that I have committed myself again to my desire for specialness. I've needed the guilt to block out the memory of truth that is without that specialness. And so what I see then is a recommitment to being the guilt, to being the home of evil, darkness, and sin. And even though I might think of that as the body, again, the body is neutral, is non-existence. And so where the Course is talking about the home of evil, darkness, and sin is in this mind with this state of guilt. Now, there's a section in the Course, I think it's chapter 18, The Passing of the Dream, a part called Beyond the Body, and there's certainly several references throughout the Course about what the body is. But that is a beautiful telling of this whole process, and then the body becomes the depository of all the guilt and the hate and the rage. And then I, again, assign it to that experience as to things around me and people who upset me rather than understanding where it comes from. And that every relationship is actually, there's the more true part of me, of you, of anyone, and then that gets projected into a relationship on the level of form. So I can never look at myself as just independent of the other person. On the level of the mind, I have made both and then projected an experience onto them, one accusing the other for that upset. So the loving use of the body, in understanding that the whole function and purpose of the making of the body and why it exists and why it seems to exist and have these experiences, is to help the mind in its attempt to alleviate the guilt and to not feel that constant sense of upset. And of course I've denied that, but the making of the world, the dream, the puppet show is all the mind's attempt to gain specialness by specificity, but also to kind of rid itself of the guilt, the intolerable guilt, and it seems to be able to do that, as we all know, in this world that we live in. So if the function of the body is to serve that purpose, is to be a projection, to be a denial, to be a alleviation of the guilt on the level of mind, it's certainly going to still be projected onto it, that experience of guilt and shame and blame that we do. But if I begin to understand that, then I understand that I don't need to fix things. That in fact, I can't fix things knowing where the source is and what their function and purpose is. So the loving purpose and function of bodies is to merely understand where they come from, why they seem to exist, what their role is, and then to, with kind of a gentle awareness, just be observant of that and not be impressed with it. That would be the counter to not giving it all the significance and importance. And in fact, when we judge ourselves and say, I shouldn't do that, I should be better, it is still that attempt to be special and not recognizing the fantasy behind this all, like where it's really coming from. So again, the loving function is to not try and do something between the bodies, not try and fix the world, although certainly those things we can do. More likely than not, there's still going to be a demonstration of the specialness that we desire because we believe there's a horror out there, something wrong that needs to be fixed. And so understanding this helps me know that there's nothing here to be fixed. There's nothing between bodies that needs to be done. The Course says bodies do nothing, bodies can't join, minds join. And while it might seem that on this level of form, again, pulling myself down to the base of the demonstration of specialness, it might seem that each of these dream characters each person has its own mind and own decision maker. But when we begin to understand that bodies aren't anything, they certainly demonstrate differences on the level of form, and mind is always the same. Mind always only has two options to it: to establish guilt in the attempt to block the memory of love and then project that out, or to not do that. So then I can begin to look at everything that goes on in the world and simply understand that it's a demonstration of one of those activities on the level of mind. That it's either going to be a demonstration of the guilt blocking the memory of love and then projecting it onto the world and that horrifying experience, that disquiet that we always have, that constant effort, or something in this world is going to remind me, because again, its source is here, that guilt isn't being activated. In fact, what I'm doing is beginning to remember and experience the love and the truth that is the only reality. Now, the terrifying thing of giving up specialness is that it begins to disappear. So as I leave the bodies and understand what the purpose of the bodies is, that it's just a mirror, that it's just kind of an arrow pointing back to the mind, and when I began to do that repeatedly after practice, this becomes less and less important. And obviously, since the function of this is to alleviate the mind of its guilt, when the mind has no guilt, it doesn't need to have a dream on which to project its specialness and guilt. So all of this goes away, all of this goes away, and what I'm finally left with is this clarity of mind that still has a notion of being separate from truth. But if I pursue my desire to give up specialness, to no longer block truth, then it's simply being absorbed back again into the heart of God. And that is part of what I'm terrified about, is not so much that I project the guilt onto God and think that God is going to attack me, which again is the heart of narcissism and specialness, and thinking that what I am dictates or defines everything, so I think that God is after me. But what I began to understand is that what I'm afraid of is being reabsorbed back into that non-duality of losing self altogether. So I obviously have to go through a constant evaluation of this before I can get to this point, get past the magic act, back to the magician, get past the tricks that go on and see where it comes from, and then truly evaluate, is this in my best interest? Is this effort that I put into maintaining this guilt really in my best interest? And as I began to evaluate this and understand that specialness really isn't all that it's made to look to be, and again, that's a part of the ego thought system, is to always make things look as they're not. Obviously, it's taking nothing and making it look like it's something. So the practice then is to simply evaluate all of this just from a standpoint of observation and knowing that this is what's going on, and then getting to the point where I really began to see that I have no interest in specialness, and that what I really long for is the reality of who I am as Christ, as the non-duality of God. And therein is the only peace. So we talk about, well, this specialness seems to be real, because it's just an expression of that desire on the level of the mind to make it real, so it seems real, but it is in fact unreal. And the only reality is the non-duality that is God. So the Course starts off with, nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists, and herein lies the peace of God. So what we begin to understand in what's going on here is this whole demonstration of what's in the mind and how it gets projected, and to not be so preoccupied with our specialness and the activities that we do here, everything from breathing to solving problems and thinking ourselves to be separate and unique and individuals, when in fact we're simply the products of an imagination, a fantasy, a dream of the mind, and its attempt to dispel itself of guilt while trying to be special, and understanding then that specialness requires that duality and guilt, so it will be constantly present when I desire specialness. And the option then to simply let that go and find it not of any benefit to me. And then the reflection of that is that I drop that shame and blame also in the world before the world disappears. That the experience is no longer, just as I give up the idea of guilt, just as I give up the idea of shame and then need a cause of blame for that, I no longer participate in a relationship where the underlying objective is to shame and blame another individual or an event or even occurrences in my own body. So it's the constant practice of that, watching oneself experience all the things that we do in the world, begin to understand that they're a product of specialness, begin to understand that it is this requirement of duality and guilt that makes that seem to happen, and then to constantly move from the body back to the mind, and to understand again, when we read the Course and understand that it's talking to the decision-making part of my mind and not to my body, your body, anybody's body, and that all bodies, in fact, are manufactured by the one mind, as I was talking about before. The bodies look different, the mind is the same, the decision-making capacity is the same, so there really is only one mind. And in fact, in the various parts of the Course, Jesus asked the decision-making part of my mind to simply look at the bodies I've made, the world that I've made, to understand what I'm doing here, what the attempt is, and what the purpose and function of all this is, and to eventually seeing past the denial of what's going on and understanding that it's self-orchestrated by the desire for specialness. Then I can obviously entertain the notion that there can be something other than what I have imposed in my mind, and that clears my mind to remember truth. So when I began to fully appreciate that the Course is really addressing the decision-making part of my mind and not me as a body in this world, what I can also begin to understand is that the bodies in this world are always and only going to be a demonstration, a projection, a reflection of what's going on, the one of two events that is going on the level of mind, one of the two experiences, either the memory of truth or the blocking of that memory and the imposing of guilt. So when I began to understand this, what I also am aware of is that the miracle is this progression from this vantage point to this vantage point to the clarity of my mind and understanding that that's the truth of God. The non-duality is the truth of my existence. And so this process, this is the course of the miracle, a perception that has been corrected, that has been healed. And so it has nothing to do again with bodies, but it is this activity on the level of mind that corrects my misperceptions and results in a projecting of a world that doesn't really exist. And so in spite of what I might think of it initially in my attempt to be special, the loving message of the Course is that in all my imaginings of the events of the world and the things that I believe are happening to me are in fact are not happening to me, that the only thing that is ever real and present is the love and peace that is the non-duality of God, of which my existence is. And so when I'm able and ready to let go of my specialness, then I don't have this experience of all this constant effort, all this drama, all these choices, all this impending sense of threat and doom and discomfort that I have to be hyper-vigilant again in trying to fix and trying to find the source of. So the loving message is that even though I might be occupied in the dream, the truth is that I, myself, and everything is always safe, that it is only a fantasy of a sleeping mind with a horror that doesn't exist, but that it is made because of my desire for specialness and individuation. And so when I'm ready to let that go, I can awaken to the truth that there was never ever any harm anywhere, and that all that truly exists at any one time is this loving, loving non-duality and peace that is the truth of everything.